In 1851 Virginia, slavery had rules, but fear had no limits. On one plantation lived a man whose very existence was considered a threat, not because he rebelled, not because he spoke out, but because of his eyes, blue, unmistakably blue. They exposed a secret the South tried desperately to bury, a jealous wife, a forbidden truth, and a murder so brutal it sent shockwaves through white society itself. This is not a legend. This is not folklore. This is the true story of how blood envy and shame collided, and how one enslaved man paid the price for a crime he did not create. The man was impossible to ignore the moment he stepped into view. On a Virginia plantation where faces blurred into a hierarchy defined by labor and skin, his appearance disrupted the order without him saying a single word. His skin carried a pale undertone uncommon among the enslaved, but it was his eyes that caused silence wherever he went. Blue eyes were not supposed to exist on a slave, not in a world that depended on rigid visual boundaries to justify ownership. Every stare he received carried suspicion, discomfort, and an unspoken question that no one dared to ask aloud. His existence alone was enough to unsettle white authority, because he looked too close to what they claimed superiority over. In the South of 1851, race was enforced not only by law but by appearance. Whiteness was treated as proof of dominance, blackness as justification for enslavement. This man shattered that illusion simply by being seen. His eyes reflected the sky, the same shade worn proudly by the men who claimed to own him, and that resemblance stripped away the comforting lie that slavery was clean or distant. He was a walking reminder that the plantation system was built not just on labor, but on violence and exploitation that crossed every boundary slaveholders pretended to respect. Whispers followed him across the fields and into the quarters. Some said he was the master's blood, born of a night never spoken of a woman who had no right to refuse. Others claimed he was a mistake that should have been sold away long ago. No matter the rumor, they all circled the same truth that everyone sensed but refused to confront. His face told a story that the plantation could not erase, and every time he passed through the yard, that story threatened to rise to the surface. Among the enslaved, his presence was complicated. Some saw him as proof of what they already knew about their masters, a living scar left behind by generations of abuse. Others feared him, not for who he was, but for what he represented. Slaves had been punished for less than resemblance, beaten for rumors, killed for suspicion alone. Standing out meant danger, and he stood out every moment of his life. He did not need to speak rebellion or raise his hands in defiance. His face itself was considered an act of provocation. The overseers watched him closely, not because he worked poorly, but because his existence made them uneasy. They feared questions from neighboring plantations, feared glances exchanged during church gatherings, feared the quiet recognition that passed between white men who saw too much of themselves in him. He was a liability, not because of anything he did, but because he made denial impossible. The plantation depended on silence, and his blue eyes threatened to break it. For the master, the discomfort ran deeper. Every time he encountered the man, he was forced to confront a past he had buried beneath authority and routine. The resemblance was not exact, but it was close enough to reopen old guilt, old fear, and old shame. In a society where reputation meant survival, this was a risk he could not fully control. The slave was not just property. He was evidence, breathing and walking in plain sight. This was the quiet tension that defined the man's life. He woke each morning knowing he was seen differently, judged not by his actions but by his features. He labored under the same sun, carried the same burdens, and endured the same cruelty. Yet his face marked him as something dangerous in a system that tolerated no ambiguity. He did not choose his eyes, but they chose his fate, drawing resentment, fear, and hatred from every direction, tightening the noose around him long before any hand ever touched his throat. The truth behind the man's appearance was one the plantation world understood far too well, even if it refused to acknowledge it openly. Children like him did not appear by accident, and no amount of public denial could erase the private knowledge shared among slaveholders. Enslaved women were treated as property in every sense, their bodies considered part of the estate, their consent irrelevant. Sexual violence was not an exception to slavery, but one of its most routine, hidden practices passed down quietly from one generation to the next. The blue-eyed slave carried that history in his blood, a living consequence of acts committed in the dark and forgotten in the daylight. On plantations across Virginia, white men exercised unchecked power over enslaved women, knowing the law would never hold them accountable. These encounters were rarely spoken of, but they shaped entire family lines among the enslaved population. The children born from such abuse were reminders of domination taken to its most intimate extreme. Some were sold away quickly to erase suspicion, others kept close and worked harder, punished for the circumstances of their birth. In this case, the child remained on the same land where the crime had occurred, growing into a man whose features made concealment impossible. The resemblance, whether subtle or striking, was enough to fuel whispers. Slaves noticed it first, then overseers, and finally neighbors who visited the plantation. Every shared glance between the master and the blue-eyed slave carried weight. People measured the shape of noses, the color of hair, the pale ring around the eyes, searching for confirmation of what they already believed. No one needed proof. In a society built on denial, resemblance itself was treated as evidence. For the master, this was not just a moral failing but a social threat. Southern honor depended on control, discipline, and the appearance of order within the household. An enslaved man who possibly carried his blood undermined that image entirely. It suggested weakness, lack of restraint, and a truth that contradicted the myth of noble plantation life. The master could not acknowledge the man publicly without destroying his standing, yet he could not erase him either without drawing attention to the very secret he wished to bury. The enslaved woman who gave birth to him had no place in official records beyond labor and ownership. Her suffering remained invisible, absorbed into the daily cruelty of plantation life. She carried the child knowing it would bind her forever to a violation she could never escape. Whether she was kept nearby or sold away, her story was stripped of importance, even though her body was the starting point of everything that followed. Her silence was not consent, but it was forced upon her by power and fear. Among white society, these secrets were both common and explosive. Everyone knew such children existed, yet each new case was treated as a dangerous anomaly. The South depended on pretending that race was fixed and pure, even as it constantly violated its own rules. The blue-eyed slave was not just an individual embarrassment, but a crack in the ideological foundation of slavery itself. His presence raised questions that could not be answered without exposing the brutality beneath the system. This hidden sin shaped the fate of everyone involved. It fed resentment, paranoia, and ultimately violence, because the only way to preserve the lie was to silence the living proof of its falsehood. The master's authority, the plantation's reputation, and the social order of Virginia all rested on ensuring that the truth remained unspoken, even if doing so demanded blood. The woman who ruled the plantation household carried her power differently than her husband. Where he commanded through ownership and fear, she controlled through observation, memory, and resentment. From the moment she noticed the blue-eyed slave, something in her hardened. She had lived her life surrounded by symbols of status and respectability, trained to preserve the image of a perfect Southern household at any cost. His face threatened that image not openly, but persistently, like a stain that could not be washed out no matter how carefully she looked away. Each time her eyes met his, she was forced to confront a truth she had long suspected but never allowed herself to fully face. The resemblance did not need confirmation. It existed in the small details she could not unsee once they registered in her mind. The shade of his eyes, the shape of his mouth, the way he carried himself all reflected back something painfully familiar. To acknowledge what she saw would mean admitting betrayal, humiliation, and the complete illusion of marital control she had been taught to believe in. Instead of confronting her husband, she turned her gaze toward the one person who could not defend himself. Her resentment grew quietly, fed by the rigid limits placed on white women in plantation society. She was expected to be loyal, silent, and composed, even in the face of infidelity that she could never publicly challenge. The enslaved man became a symbol of everything she was denied the right to address. She could not accuse her husband without risking scandal, but she could watch the slave judge him and project her rage onto his existence. Over time, her anger transformed into fixation. She began to interpret ordinary moments as personal insults. If he stood too close, she saw defiance. If he lowered his eyes, she saw mockery. Every task he performed under her supervision became proof, in her mind, that he was deliberately reminding her of what she had lost. The plantation household became a stage where her jealousy played out in silence. Servants noticed her lingering stares, her tightened expressions, her sudden commands when he entered her presence. Other enslaved people sensed the danger long before it became visible. They understood how easily white women's fears could turn lethal when supported by law and custom. They saw how she spoke his name more often than necessary, how she corrected his work even when it was flawless, how her tone sharpened whenever he was nearby. Her attention was not curiosity or concern. It was surveillance, fueled by humiliation she could never admit aloud. The woman's identity had been built around respectability, purity, and control over her household. The existence of a possible mixed race child on her own land threatened to expose her as powerless within her marriage and complicit within a system she benefited from but could not fully control. In a world where reputation defined survival, she perceived the blue-eyed slave as an enemy rather than a victim. Eliminating the reminder felt, to her, like restoring balance. Her silence toward her husband did not soften her anger. It intensified it. Without an outlet, resentment fermented into something darker, something that demanded resolution. The enslaved man became the only visible target for emotions she could not direct upward. By refusing to look away, by allowing jealousy to replace empathy, she began to cross a line that plantation society quietly permitted. Her hatred did not erupt all at once. It accumulated day after day, glance after glance, until the idea of his removal felt not just justified, but necessary. The plantation was a closed world where information traveled faster than authority could control it. Words slipped through kitchens, fields, and sleeping quarters, carried in lowered voices and exchanged glances. The blue-eyed slave became the center of quiet speculation, not because anyone wanted trouble, but because trouble seemed to follow him without effort. People talked about how often the mistress watched him, about the way conversations stopped when she entered the room, about how the overseers had begun to hover nearby whenever he worked within sight of the house. No accusation was ever spoken openly, but suspicion thickened the air. Rumors grew sharper as they moved outward beyond the plantation. Visitors noticed the resemblance and took it home with them, reshaping it with every retelling. Some said the mistress believed the slave was favored by her husband. Others whispered that she feared he might one day speak the truth of his birth. Even those who dismissed the stories sensed that something was wrong. Southern society thrived on performance, and this household no longer felt stable. The presence of the blue-eyed slave unsettled not just one family, but the illusion of order the entire community depended on. Inside the plantation, the enslaved people understood the danger of rumors better than anyone. They had seen how suspicion alone could lead to punishment, how fear could be dressed up as discipline and justified as necessity. The man at the center of it all tried to make himself smaller, quieter, more invisible, but it changed nothing. Silence did not protect him. It only allowed others to fill the gaps with their own fears. Every rumor added another layer of threat, tightening around him like a net he could not escape. The mistress's behavior became increasingly erratic as the gossip intensified. She questioned servants more often, demanded explanations for things that needed none, and searched for offenses where none existed. Her imagination fed on every whispered word. What began as jealousy hardened into certainty. She no longer wondered if the slave was a reminder of betrayal. She convinced herself he was a deliberate insult, a living challenge to her authority and dignity. The more people talked, the more she felt exposed, and exposure was something plantation society punished without mercy. The overseers, sensing tension, shifted their approach. They enforced rules with greater severity, using discipline as a way to reassert control over a situation slipping beyond comfort. The blue-eyed slave was watched for mistakes, provoked into errors, pushed until exhaustion blurred his judgment. Any misstep could be turned into proof of guilt. The system did not require truth, only justification. Rumors provided that justification long before any real incident occurred. Neighbors began to distance themselves, not out of sympathy, but out of fear of association. Scandal was contagious, and no one wanted to be too close when it finally broke. The plantation became isolated, wrapped in its own tension and mistrust. What had once been an unspoken secret now felt like a ticking threat. Everyone sensed that something had to give, that the balance could not hold forever with so many eyes watching and so many stories circulating. By the time violence became imaginable, it no longer felt sudden. It felt prepared, rehearsed by months of speculation and resentment. Rumors had transformed a man into a symbol, and symbols were easier to destroy than people. The plantation did not need evidence or confession. It needed release, and the quiet agreement that followed the gossip made it clear where that release would be directed. The night everything collapsed arrived without warning, yet it felt inevitable to those who had watched the tension build. Darkness settled over the plantation like a curtain drawn to hide what daylight could no longer contain. The air was heavy, thick with the unspoken understanding that something irreversible was about to occur. Lanterns flickered along familiar paths, casting distorted shadows that stretched and bent like silent witnesses. The blue-eyed slave was called away from his quarters under a pretense so ordinary it raised no alarm, because on a plantation, obedience was survival and questions were dangerous. What followed unfolded quickly, stripped of ceremony or restraint. Voices were raised just enough to assert authority, accusations delivered without clarity or proof. Disrespect, insolence, improper behavior, charges vague enough to justify anything that came next. He was surrounded not by law, but by power, and power needed no explanation. Hands grabbed him, forced him forward, denied him the chance to speak or understand the crime he was said to have committed. The rules of the plantation had already decided his guilt. The beating began away from the house, where walls would not hear and windows would not see. Blows landed with practiced force, each one fueled by more than discipline. This was not correction, it was release. Every strike carried months of resentment, jealousy, fear, and humiliation. Those involved did not look at his face for long. To do so would be to confront the very truth they were trying to erase. Instead, they focused on the act itself, on the idea that punishment could undo the discomfort his existence had caused. The man tried to endure in silence, knowing that resistance would only escalate the violence. Pain blurred into something distant, almost unreal, as his body absorbed the cost of a crime that had never been defined. In the darkness, he was no longer a person but a problem being handled. The night swallowed his voice, and no one came running. On plantations like this, suffering was expected, and intervention was unthinkable. When the violence went too far, there was a moment of hesitation, a brief recognition that something irreversible had occurred. The punishment had crossed into something else entirely. Panic replaced control. Decisions were made quickly, not to save a life, but to protect reputations. What had begun as an assertion of authority became a desperate attempt to manage consequences. The man lay broken, his body bearing the weight of every unspoken secret that had led to this moment. By morning, the story had already begun to change. What happened in the night was reshaped into something safer, something that fit within the accepted language of plantation discipline. Accidental death, excessive correction, an unfortunate necessity. These phrases carried power because they erased intent. They transformed violence into procedure and murder into misfortune. The truth of the night was buried beneath careful wording before the sun fully rose. The enslaved people were ordered back to work, their silence enforced through fear and routine. They understood what had occurred without being told. They read it in the stiffness of movements, in the way eyes avoided certain paths, in the absence of a man whose presence had once drawn so much attention. No mourning was allowed. Grief had no place in a system that denied humanity. Life continued as if nothing had happened, because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging too much. What remained was a hollow space where the blue-eyed slave had existed, and an unease that lingered even after his body was removed. The act meant to restore order only deepened the sense of rot beneath the plantation's surface. Violence had silenced the reminder, but it had not erased the truth that created him, and the night that ended his life became another secret layered onto a foundation already built on blood. The aftermath of the killing did not bring relief to the plantation or the surrounding community. Instead, it sparked a quiet panic that spread through white society in Virginia. This was not fear for the life that had been taken, but fear of what the act might reveal. The death of an enslaved man was not unusual enough to draw attention on its own, but this death carried implications that reached far beyond routine brutality. Too many people understood what his existence had suggested, and too many questions lingered beneath the surface for comfort. Word traveled quickly, carried by those who sensed scandal before it ever took shape. Neighbors whispered about the circumstances, about the tension that had preceded the killing, about the strange atmosphere that had surrounded the plantation for months. The blue-eyed slave had already been a subject of curiosity, and his sudden disappearance only intensified that curiosity. Silence became suspicious. In a society obsessed with appearances, the abrupt erasure of such an uncomfortable figure raised alarms rather than easing them. Local authorities were drawn in not by outrage, but by necessity. Something had to be done to prevent the story from slipping beyond control. An investigation, however limited, offered the illusion of order and responsibility. But from the beginning, the goal was never truth. It was containment. Every step was carefully measured to ensure that the focus remained narrow and the implications remained unspoken. The system moved quickly to protect itself. Statements were shaped before they were recorded. Overseers were coached, details softened, motivations blurred. What had been rage and jealousy was reframed as discipline. What had been deliberate violence was reduced to unfortunate excess. Language became the most powerful tool in preserving respectability. By choosing the right words, officials could strip the event of its meaning and reduce it to a manageable incident, one that fit comfortably within the accepted boundaries of plantation life. The presence of a white woman's involvement, direct or indirect, made the situation even more volatile. Southern society placed white womanhood on a pedestal, portraying it as pure and fragile, in need of constant protection. Any suggestion that jealousy or resentment had played a role threatened to unravel that myth. To acknowledge her influence would mean acknowledging emotional complexity, agency, and cruelty where society insisted none could exist. It was far easier to erase her from the narrative entirely. Courts, when they addressed the case at all, treated the loss as a matter of property rather than life. Compensation, if discussed, was framed around financial value, not human cost. The enslaved man's name was reduced to an entry, his identity flattened into labor statistics and ownership records. The law did not ask why he died. It asked only how to ensure such matters did not disrupt public order again. White Virginians watched closely, not out of sympathy, but self-interest. Many saw reflections of their own secrets in the situation. To allow this case to spiral into public debate would invite scrutiny they could not afford. Silence became a collective agreement. The community closed ranks, united by the shared understanding that exposure was more dangerous than injustice. The enslaved population absorbed the lesson without explanation. They saw how quickly attention shifted away, how efficiently the system sealed itself shut. They learned that even a death that unsettled white society could be smothered if it threatened the structure beneath it. Fear deepened, not just of punishment, but of invisibility, of knowing that even the most disturbing truth could be erased if it challenged power. What remained was a quiet stain that no official record could fully remove. The case did not shock Virginia because it was violent. It shocked because it came too close to revealing what everyone already knew, but refused to confront. The system survived by bearing the discomfort, preserving appearances at the cost of honesty, and allowing another life to vanish into the machinery that slavery had perfected over generations. The legal system that surrounded the plantation was never meant to deliver justice to the enslaved, and in this case it proved that truth with ruthless clarity. Laws in Virginia existed to protect property, maintain order, and reinforce racial hierarchy. When violence occurred against an enslaved person, the question was not whether a crime had been committed, but whether the incident threatened white stability. From the start, the machinery of the law moved with a clear purpose, not to uncover facts, but to contain damage. Any inquiry into the killing was shaped by what could safely be acknowledged. Witnesses from the enslaved community were either excluded or dismissed as unreliable, their voices deemed legally insignificant. Their experiences, their fear, and their knowledge of the night carried no weight in a courtroom designed to ignore them. Truth was filtered through white testimony, and even that testimony was carefully managed to avoid uncomfortable conclusions. Overseers became convenient buffers between violence and accountability. If blame needed to land somewhere, it could be placed on a subordinate whose actions could be framed as overzealous discipline rather than intentional harm. This strategy protected the household while giving the appearance of responsibility. It allowed plantation owners to distance themselves from the brutality that sustained their authority without challenging the system that enabled it. The enslaved man's life was reduced to economic terms. If compensation was discussed, it focused on loss of labor, not loss of life. Monetary value replaced moral consideration, reinforcing the idea that enslaved people existed only as assets. The law recognized him only as something owned, not someone harmed. This reduction was not accidental. It was essential to maintaining the illusion that slavery was a rational, controlled institution rather than a violent one. Legal language played a crucial role in reshaping reality. Words like accident, excess, and necessity softened the act until it barely resembled murder at all. By the time the case reached official records, intent had been erased entirely. Violence became procedure. Death became an unfortunate outcome of discipline. This transformation allowed those involved to walk away, without consequence, while preserving their standing within the community. The courts also served as a warning. Enslaved people understood that the law was not neutral ground, but hostile territory. Any hope that suffering might be recognized or addressed was extinguished by the efficiency with which the case was closed. The message was unmistakable. Even when violence crossed lines, the system would bend rather than break, ensuring that power remained untouched. White society accepted the outcome without protest. Many found reassurance in how smoothly the matter was handled. It reinforced their belief that order could be restored through the proper channels, even when those channels were built on injustice. The law's response confirmed what they already believed, that stability mattered more than truth, and that some lives were never meant to be defended. For the enslaved, the consequences were deeply internalized. Fear did not come only from the threat of physical punishment, but from the certainty that no authority existed to hear them. Silence became a survival strategy, learned and reinforced through examples like this one. The killing was not an anomaly. It was a demonstration of how completely the system controlled both bodies and narratives. What the law ultimately protected was not peace, but appearance. It preserved the fiction that slavery operated within moral and legal boundaries, even as it destroyed lives without hesitation. By closing the case quietly and efficiently, the legal system ensured that the deeper truth remained buried, allowing the machinery of exploitation to continue without interruption or accountability. After the body was removed and the paperwork finalized, the plantation returned to its routines with unsettling speed. Fields were worked, meals were prepared, and commands were issued as if nothing had been disturbed. The absence of the blue-eyed slave was treated not as a loss, but as a correction, a problem quietly resolved. No marker was placed to remember him, no name spoken in public acknowledgement. His erasure was intentional, because memory itself was considered dangerous. Among the enslaved, his story did not disappear. It traveled quietly, passed from one person to another in fragments and glances, shaped by fear and shared understanding. They remembered the way he was watched, the tension that followed him, and the night he never returned. His fate became a lesson etched into daily life, a warning about what happened when the truth became visible in a world built on lies. They did not need to speak his name for his presence to linger. The white household carried its own version of the aftermath. Outwardly, order had been restored, but beneath the surface, unease remained. The mistress no longer had to face the reminder of betrayal, yet the relief she sought did not arrive as expected. Silence replaced confrontation, but silence did not heal. It only deepened the division between what was known and what could be acknowledged. The secret that had driven everything was still there, simply buried under violence rather than resolved. The master continued his life with reputation intact, shielded by law and community. Yet the existence of the blue-eyed slave had already exposed a truth that could not be fully undone. Even in absence, the man's face lingered in memory, in moments of recognition that could never be shared. The plantation survived, but it did so by reinforcing the very cruelty that had created the problem in the first place. Beyond this single estate, the story reflected a broader reality that slavery depended upon. Mixed, race children born of coercion were everywhere, yet each one was treated as an isolated embarrassment rather than evidence of systemic abuse. The South relied on forgetting as a survival strategy. By erasing individuals, it avoided confronting patterns. By silencing stories, it preserved power. History recorded the event only in fragments, stripped of emotion and humanity. Documents noted ownership, discipline and resolution, but not fear, jealousy, or suffering. The enslaved man became a shadow in the archives, visible only to those willing to read between lines written to conceal more than they revealed. His life mattered only insofar as it threatened the narrative slavery required to endure. What remains now is not a complete account, but an echo. His blue eyes, once a source of danger, stand as a symbol of the truths slavery could never fully suppress. He represented the collision between domination and denial, between power and consequence. Though his name may be lost, the meaning of his existence endures in the understanding of how fragile the system truly was. The murder did not shock Virginia because it was violent, but because it exposed the fear beneath authority. It showed how quickly order depended on erasure, how easily justice was sacrificed to protect reputation, and how a single life could be extinguished to preserve a lie that everyone already knew was false.